This is Duke University.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Excellent. So nice to see all of you out here on such a rainy night. I apologize for the weather. Next time I'll try to order something better for us. This is the second program in a series that's called Our Right to Say, Gentrification in Durham's Future. And my name is Barbara Lau. I'm the director of the Pauli Project. It's part of the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute. It's a mouthful. Try to say that 3 times fast. Let me just ask if everyone wouldn't mind digging into your pockets and pocketbooks, grabbing your cell phones and turning them on to vibrate for us. That would be great. So one of the things that the Pauli Project does is try to honor the way that history can be a tool for social justice work in the present. So if we don't know where we've come from, if we haven't looked at the ways that other people have struggled, we're going to be behind in our own work. So many strategies and tactics that we see in civil rights work and human rights work of all kind really have their roots in other movements much earlier on. And so we wanted, as we thought about gentrification and development in Durham, and we had a program that gave us a little bit of background on that. But we're learning that they're expecting another 100,000 people to move here in the next 20 years. That just means amazing, tremendous growth, which of course is, good and challenging all at the same time. So we really wanted to start to think about those issues, but not ignore some of the things that have happened before us. And the story that you're going to hear more about tonight is truly an amazing story. A story of a lot of hard work, a story of amazing collaborations, and a success story. Crest Street and the issue around Crest Street resisting the initial path of the Durham Freeway, which we all use now all the time, is a story that has national significance and that is held up as a model for other communities who are also trying to make sure that they have that right to self-determination and that they are using all the tools in the playbook to try to maintain community cohesion and promote communities that some of you may be reading Urban Alchemy, the book by Mindy Fullilove, where she really talks about how the damage of urban renewal was not about the buildings and the structures, it was about the relationships and the networks that bind people together in neighborhoods and communities. And so this story is really also about that. And we are just incredibly lucky to have 3 amazing people who, Mike was just saying, it was 33 years ago that the settlement was reached and the beginning of this redevelopment took place, but that were involved from the beginning or involved early on and played significant roles in the process. So let me just introduce to my left, Mike Calhoun, who is from the Center for Responsible Lending. He works in Washington, D.C., but worked for a long time at Self-Help. He's a Duke grad, a UNC Law, and he came back tonight to do some business for Self-Help, but also really to be here with us. Sitting next to him is Mr. Willie Patterson, who grew up in Crest Street, came back in 1975 after serving many years in the military to find this situation that needed a lot of attention and has been working in a leadership role on behalf of the neighborhood ever since. And then next to him is Alice Ratliff, who, along with Mike, was a legal aid attorney back then and was a Duke grad and a UNC Law grad, and now currently teaches at the UNC Law School. So what I hoped we could do is, that's right, she has to wear both blues in her.
No, absolutely not. I am totally the right color.
Okay.
And that would be?
Yeah, the darker color.
All right. So what I hope is that they're going to share a little bit of this story and their roles in the story for maybe the first 45 minutes or so, and then we'd like to open it up for questions. So I really want to encourage you to think about questions and comments that you have so that when we get to that place, we can do that. We are filming tonight. We know that there's so many other things going on tonight. I was so excited to hear that last night there were 500 people at the Durham CAN meeting questioning people who are running for city council about their views on policies, especially related to affordable housing and transit development and all these other issues. So I think that just really shows us that this kind of work is still really relevant. And I know, as someone who is just a little bit younger than the folks on the panel, that I look forward to learning more from their experience as I think about my own work as an activist, and I hope you'll feel that way as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Patterson, who's going to share with us a little bit about the Crest Street he found when he returned in 1975, and how it was the same or different as the one that he left when he went off to the service.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Okay. Our name, of course, is Willie Patterson. I'm a member of the Crest St neighborhood today. I left home in 1954, joined the Air Force, and 21 years later, I retired. When I came back home in 1975, I found little or no change in the neighborhood that affected the quality of living of my people in Crest Street. There was a lot of things taking place in Durham at the time, but the thing of significance and the most humiliating thing about what was taking place in Durham and just north of Duke Hospital was the fact that they was getting ready to destroy my church, New Bethel Missionary Baptist Church, which dates back to 1879. And your math is good, that's only 14 years after Reconstruction, after the Civil War. My pastor, Elder Reed, at the time was struggling, trying to put together good thoughts as to how to preserve the church. So we had a long talk. My intentions were not to live in Hickstown, which that was the name of the community at that time. My thoughts were to move on elsewhere to Inglewood, which was a better neighborhood, but I thought was a better neighborhood. But I said to myself, and I told Dr. Reed, that if you're going to be part of the process to bring about change, I didn't need to move. So I guess the first challenge is that, Mike, you might remember, you and I, when the federal government gave Durham some money to build better streets and highways, and that we organized ourselves in February of 1975, and the city of Durham had no intentions of spending one dime on strip pavement in Crest Street. The community was left to die. And to be frank with you, I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's toes, but the truth has to be told. It was the expansion of Duke University. So I got involved in that process, and I remember my father telling me one day, he says, you're not going to get that money to improve the streets. We organized in February 1975, now we voted in president. I continued to work. We challenged the city, and I told the council that there were no paved streets in Crest Street. The only pavement that was in the front of New Bethel Missionary Baptist Church. When I was a kid, 12, 13, 14 years old, we used to go to the front of the church just to skate. And they was planning on using most of that money. All of us are putting that way in other developed white neighborhoods. So we were liberated, so in England, the argument made sense, and we ended up with strip pavement over Crest Street. Well, that was fine. Now they've been getting ready to destroy our fabric, the cohesiveness of our community. Let me tell you something about Crest Street. I doubt if you live today in a community that you everybody in that neighborhood. Well, everybody had to know everybody in Crest Street. We depended upon each other. There wasn't a house that did not have garden space in the rear of that house. There was hog pens sitting behind the schoolhouse and into the woods and in the garden spaces and things like that. When people raised their hogs and grew the gardens, they weren't selfish. They thought about the neighbor next door. There was widows and there were people that depended on each other. The closeness and the cohesiveness of that neighborhood was fantastic. In the fall of the year, when hog killing time came and harvest time, they helped one another. It wasn't an uncommon thing or an uncommon scene to sit inside the house and there was a hot burner stove there and you could see out through the cracks of that house. And I just said that something has to be done. There's got to be a better quality of life, and I think that's not the half for us. And I decided that I would hang around, listen to some of the stories that was told to me by Willie, who was the pastor of the church for 44 years. And I decided to give my attention to the problem that was at hand. Coming out of the military with almost 21 years of service, I had driven myself into a position to defend this country. And that meant everybody in this country, they were Americans. And I really don't agree with so much of this Afro-American. I'm not an Afro-American, I'm American. I was born in the United States. I may be a different color, but I am an American. But nevertheless, it made no difference with me. We tried to sit down and talk about some strategies that we could first save our church, and doing that we could save our community. And I think about this time, Mike and I was sure, and several of the guys were still in school. I know Mike was out at Duke, and Alice, you was at Carolina or whatever it was. And there was several organizations being formed around the city of Durham. And some of these organizations got involved because of electricity, the high cost of electricity, which was current action by the ground and Web Building, all those people got involved in. And I left that because my attention was turned toward Crest Street. And I felt that if I could help do anything to bring about some changes, I stayed in Crest Street. So, but
how about if I share a couple of things and then you come right back to this and to Alice to sort of put this in broader picture of what was going on in Durham at the time. A couple of trends. Durham, as it is now, was incredibly segregated. What had been one of the highlights in the Crest Street community, they finally got a new elementary school in 1952. Brown v. Board came along, and so the city's response was 2 years later to board up the brand new school rather than to integrate and send white kids to school.
That's exactly right. At that time, there were two other schools. One of the schools was almost in the community, which was Southside. And EK Pole over on 9th Street, I think it is, 9th Street. But nevertheless, Crest.
And let me add, if I can, let me add about Haytide.
Yeah.
Unless you want to jump in there, but so Durham went through what most cities did in the 50s with vast urban renewal. And so there had been in the area north, let's see if I get my direction, south of the freeway, over near Fayetteville and Austin, in North Austin Street, a thriving black business area known as Haytop. And when the early sections of the freeway were built, it plowed through that, and they combined the freeway dislocation. And if you follow freeway locations, this Durham was not atypical. So they cleared out that neighborhood with a promise to rebuild it, but nothing really came of that. I remember in '75, they had done that in late '50s, early '60s. They had a few portable buildings that some of the businesses were in at the time. And so people had less trust. And then let me just get you to where y'all said no to the highway. Two other things happened. Durham was undergoing at that time a change in government. Durham historically had, in some ways, a more progressive government in the South, in that politics were largely divided. You had a middle-class black community, middle-class white community, but it was clear the county commission, the city council was all white dominated at the end. They made concessions, they built good libraries in the black community, but the power structure was totally white controlled. And in the early '70s, we had the first wave of progressive black-white politics and elected Julia Borbley Brown.
Never got elected.
Should know the right dates, but I think 1975 was around then was the first time you had a progressive majority on the city council, and it was quite a shock to the community. And so then the last thing was just how people viewed the community. So the community, like many of the gentrification things we look at today, 80% plus of the residents rented their houses. So there were homeowners among the more elderly, but it was overwhelmingly rental community. They had been in their houses over about 30 years each in the rental houses. So the freeway was planned to be somewhat different from what it is now. There was going to be a vast Cloverleaf interchange. Right in the middle, and then their relocation plan. They're required by law to prepare a formal relocation plan. The relocation plan was that there were 150 households in Crest Street. There were 1,000 public housing units in Durham that had a turnover of 10% a year. And so in a little over a year, there'd be plenty of units in public housing for everybody to move into. So that was the relocation plan. So let me hand it back over to a view of the community's response at that point.
What had happened, in my opinion, that the powers in the Haytop community allowed the Department of Transportation to move forward. And there offered little or no resistance. But there was another black neighborhood along in the path of that 147 that was the short, and that was Brookstown. And I guess the timing of it is that about the time I got out of the service and really got into knowing what was happening to us at Crest Street is when we really got involved to try to save the neighborhood, I'll put it that way. In the years to come, I remember, Mike, that when we filed that Title VI class action suit, and I was a student then at North Carolina Central University. My major then at that time was in political science, And after a year or so I was there, Willie Harvey was was in charge of labor, AFL-CIO in the state of North Carolina. The local union that you trying to figure out why am I speaking about that, had lost their business agent. And I was asked to come in to get a place to have an election. And I had all of these other things going at the time. I came in and helped the local 77 get an election where we were able, for the first time, local 77 ended up with employee rights and getting back to Crest Street. All of these things began to fall in place. I met Mike and I met Alice, I met Shul, I met Doug Gully and quite a few other people that gone on to make prominence for themselves. And we knew it was wrong. Crest Street was a neighborhood that was a poor neighborhood, there's no doubt about that. But it had some richness that few other people didn't know about. And when Liz Freeman came in, she was an anthropologist from Duke and did a survey and did a study. That's when Durham began to find out how close knit family that we had out in Crest Street. And getting with Mike and Alice and some of the other local people that just passes through my mind occasionally, that we planned some strategies. We planned some meetings at the church. We planned meetings, appeared numerous times before the city hall. We organized, become part of the steering committee over in Raleigh, which Tom Bradshaw was Secretary of Transportation, I'll put it that way. And we found out in the years to come, about 2 years after then, that we were just spinning our wheels over there, having to travel to Raleigh every day for meetings. It was too politically inclined. We had mayors in the city of Durham, Wayne Cabin and what was his other name? I forgot his name, anyway, it's insignificant. I was talking about that.
Add something here, Tab. You touched on something I think that was really important, is if you just looked at Crest Street, it looked like a rundown, no paved streets. The exterior of the houses were not very pretty because, as Michael said earlier, 80% of them were absentee landlords who really didn't care a whole lot. But once we started representing the community and we got to know it, we realized that within the community there were these, incredible networks, and inside the houses, these houses that didn't look so great outside were beautifully kept inside because these tenants had lived in the same houses for 30 years. And so a big part of our beginning was to bring that information to other people. And there were some very good people on the city council, even kind of before the change, I guess. A lot of them with good connections. Margaret Keller was on the city council then, Sylvia Kirchhoff, both of them husbands were on the faculty at Duke, and good, well-meaning people. But their thought was, well, guys, we're doing this community a favor, by getting rid of it, and putting these people in better housing. So that was one of the big things, was just introducing the true Crest Street to people like that, and convincing them that no, that's not what's best. And so people have asked along the road, well, why did Crest Street work? And we talked about this a little bit earlier. Michael and I didn't go in Steve Shul and these various people with People's Alliance, when I didn't go in and say, oh, we're going to do this for you. The community came to us, and they were fortunate to have somebody like Pat come back, and they knew what they wanted. They wanted to preserve that church. They wanted to preserve that community in both senses of physical housing and, people to people. And so they came to us and said, can you help us do this? As opposed to, I think there are over 1 million people out there who try to sort of impose what they think is good for somebody else. I think that's the real secret to the initial success of Crest St, which was, getting the road modified and the community preserved.
Well, in addition to that is that we found, I was elected president. The community had a lot of confidence in me, and they had a lot of confidence in the Reverend Reed. They trusted their lives and their care, the future of the whole community with us. We also found in the many meetings that we were attending, there was never any dissensions among any of us. There were good people. There were good followers. The success of any program or anything, or any government, anything, you're going to have good followers. The people in Crest St depended on us. They gave us the latitude that we needed, and we used it to try to improve the quality of living in the Crest St neighborhood. And to this day, 33, 34 years later, you can see it. We own 114 housing units in Crest St. There are 21 at New Bethel, 24 at L.W. Reed, 65 at Crestview Apartments, 2 single-family houses and 4 duplexes. We have acquired that many units. We manage it. We hired a managing agent to come in to help us because we don't know all the rules and regulations and stipulations that the federal government requires. So we knew that we didn't have the expertise ourselves to do it at the time, but we were intelligent enough to go out and get some outside help, and we were able to do that. Folk, we have given away thousands and thousands of dollars to our children that have come through the Crest St neighborhood under the Betty Johnson tutorial program. They have gone, some of them have gone on to college and have become master's and doctor's degree, and as one that stands out in my mind to this day is Calvin Johnson. Somewhere he's a pilot and he's working for NASA. There are numerous that have obtained master's degrees and head in healthcare institutions. One young lady, the old she's in Miami, Florida, in charge of a healthcare institution. And I can't say that everybody has been an asset. But I tell you what, if they weren't an asset, after the settlement had taken place, and Crest St was a whole neighborhood, we had a lot of deaths to take place. And the guidance of the people that have gone on, and the enlistment that they handed to their children, and the sternness in which they disciplined their children, I was kind of disillusioned a little bit. I thought that some of those that had gone on would come back to the neighborhood to preserve the integrity in which Mary Booth, myself, Betty Johnson, and Reverend Reed, and all that had put forth. But some of them didn't. And they didn't come back, and the help that I thought it would be here today for someone to step into my place, well, I'm going out of here, and it's probably a year, but I'm not going until I'm satisfied that the leadership is there. I don't care how old I get. So that's the story of Crest Street. I mean, I'll be too willing to answer any questions that you may have, but,
So Tab, maybe let me fill in a couple places so people can understand sort of how it came to loggerheads and then how and what the resolution was. And so as I mentioned, you had a progressive city council come into office, and after a lot of battle, they voted by, it's been 13 members, I think 7-6, to oppose building the freeway through the community. And this was like a wake-up call to some forces who weren't pleased at the direction they saw this new city council going. And so this became like the symbolic issue in the next election. And in the next election, there were 7 seats up, 6 seats plus the mayor, made it to 13. Mayor was up every 2 years, council, half of them up each 2 years. So a slate of 7 white men were elected, and they took office, and 10 minutes later voted to build the freeway through the community with no assistance.
That was in '79.
The other thing that significant, Mike, I remember that it was in February. It was cold. The snow and ice was on the ground. And you asked me, is it probable that we could get some people to go? That was on a Sunday afternoon before the city council met that Monday night. We gathered on the steps of the city hall for a prayer service after Reverend Reed had preached. And that Monday night, when the city council met, it was favorable to us. I never will forget that. So, we believed, I put it that way, we believed.
So after the new city council comes in and votes this, there had been pending at that time this Title VI complaint, which says you can't.
I was going to ask more about that. Like, so this is a Title VI complaint regarding the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and I'm curious, how did you all decide to file that? Was that something other communities had done in the past successfully? I'm just curious, as a strategy, since both of you are lawyers, how did that come about?
Well, I tell you, you may not remember this, but I do. Like I said earlier, that I was a student at Open Arkansas Central. I did some research work. I may not have shared it with Mike and Alice, but religiously, every time a highway was built in the United States, that they had to go, they would go through a black neighborhood. And it was part of a paper that I wrote in the recycling class sometime, way back in 1976 or 77, somewhere like that there. And that became just an extra thing that I did for myself. It gave me some idea about what it was really like to be poor and to be in a black neighborhood with low-income people. Because I had experienced many discomforts in the Air Force. And when I left the Air Force, I left there with a promotion of master sergeant hanging on my shoulder. All I had to do was to say, but I didn't say. I did some things, I did some coding and all of those fantastic effectiveness reports that I had received, outstanding, and military service award with oblique clusters and all of that kind of stuff. I've seen guys that, because I was in administration, the guys that were mechanics that were all part of a winning team, I was being passed over. I had 7 years away from Master Sergeant when I left there. But I didn't stay, but they finally promoted me to try to entice me to stay, and I wouldn't take the promotion. I went ahead and retired, and I'm glad I did.
Glad you did too. So you wrote the paper that kind of gave you the background information, so then did you go and find these two and say, hey, I want you to file this suit for me?
No, I didn't do that. I got it from my own information. All it did, that paper did, when I wrote that paper, was to solidify my thinking and brought me more than aware of what was going on around us. That's what that paper did, and how weak our government was. And that a lot of these things that were taking place, honest to God, was no more than behavior practices. Something that had been handed down in all generations of people from time. And we just have to learn how to digest some of these things. And that's exactly why I did it, and I've been able to understand that I didn't tell Mike, but I also tried to use that paper to incite them, because they was law students. They had a whole lot of expertise more than I had.
But you knew which direction they needed to head. So Mike and Alice, tell us how you came to filing that suit. I think that was a linchpin in this whole process.
It was.
Well, I guess one thing. That's working. We had a lot of leverage in this case because this was, 90% federally funded. And so there were a lot of requirements before you could spend, probably more requirements than unfortunately there are now under Title VI. And the road had been stopped actually by a student group at Duke, an old environmental group, ECOS, and for those of you who've lived here a long time, you know the road stopped there on the road for years and years and years. And so there was an injunction that gave us some power, basically saying they had to follow all the Environmental Protection Act, NEPA had been passed and whatnot. So, it's one thing to try to just convince people and do things, but leverage is a good thing. And we were lucky in so many ways. Politically, we were lucky. This was during the Carter administration. So the director of the Office of Civil Rights for the Federal Department of Transportation, right? I think that's what it was. Not highway, but the transportation. For someone who actually believed in civil rights. I mean, we had administrations where that wasn't necessarily true. So basically, and Michael actually did more of the work on this, but the complaint basically said, we want you to withhold this federal money until the State Department of Transportation does what they need to do. We were also incredibly lucky to have mentioned Liz Friedman from Duke. She was actually a postdoctoral student under Carol Stack, who was in the Department of Anthropology, who did all these surveys to show that, and I guess the basic thesis there was that environmental impact included family impact, which means what does it do to families and all these connections. So we sort of got Liz Friedman for an entire year and her students to do this survey. We had a fantastic traffic engineer who donated his time so that he could tell us, I don't know how many of you are transportation engineers or anything, but I mean, boy, they love to draw maps. Put them out there, but we didn't know what they had to do, and he gave us the information. He said, you asked them for this. Well, they haven't done that, so that meant they haven't gone through the steps. And so these are the sorts of things that I think, why don't you follow up on this, because actually he was primarily responsible for drafting this complaint. He did far more of the work on that than I did.
So again, Title VI simply says there is not supposed to be racial discrimination in the use of federal funds. So we argue.
Seems like a simple idea, right? But clearly the track record was not there. In fact, it had been used oppositely.
And so we filed a complaint, and this was This was, I think, one of the first times they had ever used that to hold up a freeway project. And so they said, you cannot build this project if you resolve this complaint. So we had that leverage. And things got heated. The city council was not delighted with this, and this did continue past the 1980 election where there were some national changes. And so I remember one thing, probably the most heated, and the community really deserves the credit for standing up tough, was at one point the city council tried to coerce the community, and they started rezoning the community commercial property use with the hope that property would start flipping to commercial use and make the community take whatever was offered. And the community actually withdrew from the negotiations at that point and said, yeah, stop this, reverse what you've done before we'll come back even to the table, which I think sent an important message of toughness. And then finally, we did reach an agreement, and the two major components were, first of all, to redesign and relocate the community. As I said before, it ran right through the community with a cloverleaf ramp that you would expect to see out in the middle of the country, not in an urban setting. So they got rid of the cloverleaf to a typical type urban design. It wasn't really all that extraordinary, and moved it to the side, which left space where the community could be relocated. And then that was the other part of it, was they relocated a lot of the housing, actually picked it up, and then through stacking, as you have to do in the affordable housing world, stacking a variety of assistance programs, using the full power of relocation benefits required under federal law, and then using some other things, we were able to provide home ownership to the majority of the members in the community, and ultimately, with again a bump in the road to get there, when TAP was referring to owning these houses, there's a community development corporation that owns and operates all the rental housing. So there's affordable rental housing in the community, both for families and for senior citizens in the community, owned by the organization that TAP heads.
Right. One other thing that I think is significant, when we withdrew, the staff that was working with us from the federal government, state, city, and what have you, we moved those meetings to the basement of New Bethel Baptist Church. And we were in those meetings sometime to 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. We was in no hurry. And the people that lived in Crest St were bringing us food. And I think what happened then, they found that the people was on the committee. I really think they found that we were humans too. Because they didn't have to do it. They were bringing their food, they were staying up late at night, and we were sitting in the basement of that church. Sometimes hungry, sometimes not. And the people would offer to break bread with them because they knew then that we were working in their behalf, and they trusted us. And that's when things began to move forward. It's when we got out of Raleigh and got into Durham in the basement of New Bethel Baptist Church. That's when the settlement was at hand.
I think another important thing here, we're talking about the calling a halt to these negotiations. That was a rather risky thing to do. If that had not worked, then the community could have been scattered with no benefits at all. And, Pat mentioned earlier about there were leaders and the people, members of the community trusted the leaders. But we also set up a very formal structure for communicating with the community. I mean, we incorporated this council and we had formal officers, but we also had, I don't know what, maybe 4 times a year or something, community meetings in the church, you know, where everybody came and things were explained to everybody, and everybody had a say, and my line is always, we didn't make these decisions from the top down. We took our marching orders from the council, the newly elected council. But that council also had input from the entire community. One of the first things I said is, you need to be doing, the community needs to be the moving force, not the experts or whatever who come in from the top. And I think, and that was a little dicey there at one point. In fact, even Reverend Reed was a little nervous about that, because he was worried, truly, sincerely, worried about his flock, and he said, well, I don't want, my people there to be left with nothing. And, after quite a bit of consultation, I mean, it took us a while before to make that decision, but again, it's not decision that Michael and I made. It was a decision the community made. At that point, I think we had worked with them long enough that and we were pretty much kids then, okay? We were fresh out of law school. But, these people trusted these, 2 white people that they really hadn't done for very long. And that's how things work.
But I think you're making some really good points, right? You're making these points that when you bring decision makers to the community and you have the meetings in the community, it changes the way people see each other, right? As Mr. Patterson said, people begin to see each other as human beings who need to eat and need to do the things they need to do and have families, and the impact of their decisions is different when you're sitting in someone's neighborhood. I also think that, Mr. Patterson was saying that, he knew a lot about this, but he also knew to ask for other people to help and to go to the university or to identify people who could help in a way that made sense to the neighborhood, right? Not the researchers, and this has happened in other neighborhoods I've worked in Durham, where the researchers kind of flock to the neighborhood when the neighborhood hasn't invited them. And then the results of that are often very disastrous. So inviting people in, Mr. Patterson obviously was sort of cashing in on his social capital to allow some of the researchers to gather information to basically tell the government what the neighborhood already knew. We're a cohesive neighborhood. We rely on one another. Those ties are really important. If you need to write it up in a report and use data and tables and footnotes to do that, great. If that's what it takes, fine. We already know this. We're willing to share this with you, right? So thinking about the ways that your skills and, that you were able to sort of identify the skills that you needed from people, invite those, but manage that process in a way that kept people in the neighborhood and neighborhood leadership at the center. And I think what you were just saying, Alice, about the decision-making, again, is really important. Mr. Patterson, you said people, they didn't always agree, but you came to agreement, right? There came to a point where there was some consensus about the decision to walk away or the decision to fight this. I mean, I don't want to underestimate how significant it was that here they used this strategy and it worked. How many other neighborhoods across the United States don't exist except in people's memories? And people will talk about Hayti like this all the time, that exist in people's memories, but were destroyed through, urban renewal, urban removal, highway projects, transportation projects. We're facing some of those same things now with new transportation policies and choices. And I do think that some of the things that you've shared really are those kinds of lessons for any of us who are working in this now, to really take, and they may seem intuitive, but when we think about where do the meetings happen, do the decision makers come into the neighborhoods? Are we meeting on site? Are we eating together? How are neighborhoods making decisions? Those are all really, really important ways, and that, you were willing to go to Raleigh for a while, make those trips, go to those meetings, but it just wasn't working and you needed to bring it home. So I think some of that is really instructive in the process now. And I like the idea that y'all were young and willing to try things and put in the hard work, and maybe look for strategies that folks who had been in that fight for longer wouldn't necessarily have gone with. So, I think there's a little bit of that, just we actually believe we could win. Maybe we don't know any better, but we actually believe we can win. There's a lot to be said for that sometimes too.
So one other component of this, and I think lesson, is that a lot of progressive organizations supported this fight. And so they broadened their support. You had Durham Voters Alliance, People's Alliance, of course the Durham Committee on Affairs of Black People. And not all these organizations had exactly congruent wishes. Some of them were against the freeway for environmental reasons, for example. But I think importantly, they all came together at the end and supported the community's decision and got
determination,
got fully behind that.
Well, it took a lot of work.
Bring their own committee in. They were brought in kicking and screaming. Because it wasn't black versus white, it was sort of haves versus have-nots. And the Durham Committee was basically made up of the black power structure in Durham. And I guess, that took a lot of work. These things weren't just givens.
A turning point was there was new leadership there. Babe Henderson took over. And other things that reflected sort of the macro system. I remember he got involved in this. We researched and found that, in the 100-year history or whatever, the Department of Transportation, State Department of Transportation, they had a 15, 20-member board from people around the state. They'd had one person of color out of that entire period.
There was a lady, her name was Annabelle Jones. Probably all of you know where the VA hospital sits now. That was her property and her family's property. Right across from the VA, where the eye center is at Duke, there was a riding stable. White folks went over there to ride the horses and enjoy themselves. Miss Annabelle lost her property on the eminent domain. She got enough money out of that property to build 2 houses on Crest Street, where the recreation, in the parking lot where the recreation center is now. The first house she built, you get this, was a rest home for the elderly. Mm-hmm. And she lived in the other one, and this was back in 1983 or 84, whenever they took a property, when it is. She built it. She was very conscientious and loved old people. Then she built her house. So it kind of tell you what kind of people that surrounded each other and had the responsibility to care for each other. I'm true.
So I had a question about eminent domain and the way that people are compensated, I guess now as opposed to then, based on that story. Was Miss Annabelle, did she manage her money well such that she was able to buy the properties in Crest Street? Because it seems like now, when people's properties are taken by eminent domain, that there's often, they couldn't replace their property, certainly not buy 2 new properties. Mm-hmm. So in terms of new strategies and what people can expect when attempting to get a good outcome for a community that may be moved? What can
Well,
we
my
expect?
thought, my answer to yours is this, to your question is this. The idea of black folk at that time, the majority of black, is to try to get their kids through 6th grade or 7th grade. There wasn't a whole lot that the families of black people knew about economics. They knew how to survive and to create. So she knew that if she got enough money to build a house on Crest Street and designate one of them for the elderly, that she had fulfilled probably her mission here on earth. And then she built herself, became secondary. As far as knowing how to use her resources, and I'll guarantee you, and I don't know for sure, that it was probably less than what she was entitled to. So that's...
So, Tab, you said 1980, I don't think that's what you meant, right, when this
No,
happened?
when they bought her property, it was long time, in the 60s. In the 60s, yeah. They bought her property and she had to move and...
But just even in the story of Crest Street, there was this disinvestment because they were expecting to just be able to buy the properties, and as properties are disinvested in, and I would guess we can look around Durham now and see where disinvestment is taking place. If then they decide to use eminent domain, then therefore the property is worthless. So, I mean, it's not a good, it's often, it's rare that you see it. It is sometimes used as a good tool, but very rarely, I think. Yeah. Anybody else have questions? Yeah, Jeanette.
I have 3 small questions because I left Durham in 77 and came back in 88, and so I heard about the fight and the various elections from Greensboro, where I was living. So my 3 small questions are, who was at the table for the negotiations? Not the people's names, but their roles. It was the Crest Street neighborhood and the lawyers and the city council.
Transportation.
The U.S. Department of
No,
Transportation?
North Carolina Department of Transportation.
Yes.
The settlement, both the U.S. and North Carolina Department of Transportation. Who else was in the negotiations at that point, Mr. Patterson, in the last part?
Well, the Crest Street Community Council, I think they were the
Right.
main players of it. We were the ones who started the mess.
And there were representatives from the city too, because for this to work, I've actually forgotten some of these details at this point, but there was, grant money, urban development, redevelopment grants, so people had to, so I guess
All those people had to work together,
Yeah.
right? But by this time, I mean, and there's a great article on the panel, you can read more about it, but some of those political action committees weren't not at that point in the negotiation, it was really the actual stakeholders, right?
But
So
in
the
earlier
neighborhood-
meetings, the political
Absolutely.
action, the Durham Voters Alliance and the People's Alliance, because I represented the DVA and Paul Lukey represented the People's Alliance. And another element that was there was not just the environmental, so we're talking about, I met Mike in '75, and Alice and Mike shouldn't downplay the way in which they understood to reach out to other elements of the community to bring them in. And it wasn't just environmental. There were those of us who didn't want the expressway because we wanted public transportation. So all these years later, we're still saying we want good public transportation. But we were able to take that hard line in some of those negotiations to say, well, you're talking about a better road or mitigating it, but there are those of us who say no road whatsoever. We don't want it to happen. Put the money into public transportation. And that was additional leverage then as...
Well, right, and there's 200 families in Crest Street. Took a lot more people than that to elect new people to city council, to show up at city council meetings, to be visibly unhappy with what was being presented as a possibility.
Can I ask a second?
Yeah, one more.
Okay. Right, because it was the political issue in Durham for the whole time that I was not here. Bill Smith was like elected one round and then UCC minister, and then unelected the next round, and but my other question, it's sort of towards the end of all of this, in 86 or 7, Duke University was implicated in what happened to the community, and to another one right nearby. Yeah.
Brookstown?
Wall
Walltown?
No, I mean, right nearby. Anyway, there was some money leveraged from the university for use, was it in the Crest Street community? Or in another community that had been moved, across the street part for all those parking lots? Can't remember. Okay, nobody, you don't know what I'm talking about, Mike. All right.
I'm sure we can figure out who you can ask though. Other questions? Yes.
Alice, you mentioned earlier that there was need to like introduce the real Crest Street to the larger community, specifically like letting people know that these are actually very beloved homes. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that process and like what you used specifically to communicate that and to whom. I know that you mentioned the anthropologist was for you, but were there other ways of doing that?
Well, the information that the anthropologist got, we probably used more in the official stuff than, I mean, we literally, we set up a tour, invited all the members of the city council to go. And I think about probably half of them went, and that was when, you mentioned Bill Smith. He was the one person on that city council at the beginning who was with Crest Street. He was the single voice there. And actually, my mom both joined because of him. But people like Margaret Keller and Sylvia Kirchhoff, who, good sort of liberal, sorts, who were in the vein, well, we think it's best for Crest Street. Those were the people whose minds were changed by that. I'm sure others, those are just the names that come to mind. But we had a tour. I mean, we took them out 2 or 3 hours on Saturday morning, and we got various members of the community to agree that they could come out to their houses, and it was, boots on the ground kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you.
So looking at the chronology sheet with the construction beginning in the first segment in 67 and first segment opening in 70, that's through Hayti?
Yes.
And why didn't they pick Crest Street to start with instead of Hayti?
So I think the initial idea was to link downtown to RTP. So that piece of the highway was built before Crest, is that right? Yeah, that was built first.
This is incorrect grammar. That was a more choice piece.
Well, I think that was it was planned to go to where it goes now, but it was the student group at Duke called ECOS, environmental group, that, because they did not want it. I mean, obviously the expressway splits into 2 campuses at Duke.
Right.
And so they brought the initial lawsuit that got the injunction from the federal court judge in Greensboro, saying you cannot build this until you meet all the requirements. So I guess it was, again, it's kind of relevant that that happened. I mean, ECOS didn't do that because of Crest Street.
So there's going to be 2 hanging questions. One is why Hayti first, and the second one is because they started with Hayti, looking at the time frame on the chronology, does that give community folks enough time to step back and say, we're going to organize, as opposed to if it starts in Crest Street, then it's a done deal.
Didn't they also, I think there was also an issue of they didn't have all the money for the whole freeway when they started building it. So they had to make some choices, and connecting to 40 and to RTP was maybe a higher priority for the city fathers who decided that. And as Mr. Patterson said, the power structure in Hayti actually didn't, had some buy-in. There was a vote. There was a referendum in Durham, and it was approved. And it was approved by the Black community and the white community. So there was a lot going on there, politically, who knows what else in that in that process, but then, right, it got stopped. And what I think is so interesting is, you know, we think about these movements so separately. Well, there's the environmentalists, and there's the anti-racist activists, and there's the people who care about public transportation, and there's people who think about urban design in different ways. I mean, that was very popular in the 70s. It was the whole birth of that urban sociology. I can say I was an urban sociology major in college, and we read all those people and learned about the way that culture was impacted by federal policy. And so you think about that and how, you know, some might argue it's a perfect storm, but really it was a way that people found some common cause around something that they wanted to see happen differently than was on the drawing boards, right? So we had kind of everybody joining at a time that it helped move the whole thing forward, right?
So yeah, to clarify, so the road was planned for the entire segment. It was being built in segments due to funding because they were getting allocations of money. In Durham, you only get so much. Everybody in the state's competing for this money. And then the ecos, so.
Who was that? Do you remember any of the folks that were leading that effort?
The gullies.
So they were trying to stop.
Wiz and Dub Gully.
Oh,
They were trying to stop the section that went between the campuses. And is what had happened was the Environmental Protection Act that requires environmental impact statements had been passed after the road had been started there. The question was, did it apply to these spaces that were existing, that were under construction then? And so in essence, they lost their suit because they built that section and then the court just said, the Department of Transportation, you have to comply with the law if you want to build the rest of it. And come back to me and show me you complied with the law.
I have a friend who grew up in the West End, and she tells stories about how in order to get the kids in the neighborhoods ready for this, they literally would bring in sandboxes and little toys that would show earth moving and have the kids all play with them so that they would know, because it literally, I mean, highway goes right through here. So the whole area behind this warehouse, all the way over to West Chapel Hill Street, was neighborhoods and streets, and people lived here, and they all went to some of the same schools, and so, you know, there was a lot of strategy around preparing people for this change, and it wiped out the neighborhoods right around, there were African American neighborhoods right around where the freeway path is right here too.
It might entertain young people just to tell them what 147 used to stop at the package store, the beer store, right on Irwin Road where Irwin turns into 9th Street. So everybody on that highway poured onto Irwin Road. It just
Why
stopped
Sam's Quick Shop there, right?
Yeah, Sam's Quick Shop. It just stopped right here. You either turned right and went to 9th Street or went on Irwin Road. I mean, it's hard to picture now.
You had a question, I'm sorry.
I was wondering, when the community was relocated and the Folkways made the transition, the gardens, I assume the Hogs didn't, but, or maybe they did too. And did that transition successfully?
No, the people at Crest St, we knew that changes were being made. And like I said before, it was an old neighborhood. And the support cast of the children that followed the passing of the old folk, the ideas and thoughts of the future was entirely different. When I was coming through high school and what have you, and been in a black neighborhood, my first only thought was, if I can just get him through high school, I would have accomplished something. Well, I got through high school, and 20 years later, I went in the Air Force, and I came back, retired from that, and I got myself through college. So my sense of direction at that time was to get an education. We knew that's what it took if we were going to survive the generation of people that come along. All we wanted was the opportunity. Now, what has happened, in my opinion, since then, is so many things that's been handed out. We didn't have to work for them. When I say we, I'm talking about all of us. It was just everybody, everybody that thought of a program that constituted spending money that you thought that would be viable. We had the right people in the right places to get some of these things done. Until this day, we still looking for answers of how we may mismanage our government
But then I think.
during the 80s and 90s and
So when did, because I remember when we first went out there, there was a cow, Crest Street cow, I think.
Yeah.
And it was a horse, was it?
A horse.
I do know the difference between a cow and a horse. But so when did, you know, and there were a lot of people had chickens, I remember. So when did that end? I think that was really, when.
It didn't seem like it was a central part of the community.
Alice, after the redevelopment, we had smaller spaces to work in. And like I said before, there were hog pens and there was garden spaces. There were areas much, much larger. The community is probably sitting at about 1/3 of the size of what it was prior to redevelopment, I'll put it that way. And a lot of things that the city installed, laws that you couldn't have chickens, and your hog pens had to be so many feet from your houses, and that included the horses, and what you're talking about, Mr. Reverend Boone had a mule, and my Uncle Saul had 2 horses that he used to travel all over West Durham, plowing gardens, and all of that ended because they didn't have any space to house these things. Not because that they weren't needed. It's just because the time changed. That's what happened.
So one additional aspect I would raise, and I think through a testimony to the work that TAP has done over the years, which, you know, maybe the harder work was after the settlement than the work up to in many ways. So at the time, we were pushing for community control of all the land in the community, including the rental property, and there was very fierce opposition to that.
That sounds way too European.
From all the operations, and so we were only half successful. So we were able to get 2 parts of it placed in community control. That was the housing for the elderly, which is federally subsidized, comes with rent subsidies. And then there were units of condominiums, and I'm happy to say self-help provided the financing. And so, you know, it did 2 things. It gave the community control over those properties, and it also has turned into a stream of income for them. But we had sort of the social experiment, the other part of the rental housing for families, non-elderly, had 2 aspects. First, it was available because the city council couldn't place it in any neighborhood in town. Over the previous 8 years, it was sitting there about to expire because no one wanted subsidized housing in their neighborhood. So we had the funds available, that's part of it. But then they let that be controlled by private builders and private developers, and this was an out-of-state partnership that was mainly in it for the tax credits that they could get.
Right.
But they allowed these units, they didn't oversee the management well. They allowed the units to fall in disrepair. They became a serious hazard. There was a drug murder in the parking lot of the units. And then they finally fell into bankruptcy and literally were falling apart. And at that point, TAP and the community actually bought them out of the bankruptcy court.
Right.
And so that's how they came down and rebuilt them. But just what a difference it makes. Because, I mean, TAP, for example, he talks about they hire outside managements. Well, they replaced two of the management companies. It wasn't before, I remember when we had problems, it was we go and beg, if you will these folks, start maintaining their property and such. And it's a little world of difference when the community says, we're going to decide how this property is maintained.
Well, again, that's, I think, one of the lessons of thinking about how to resist gentrification now is thinking about how communities can have control over some of the housing in their neighborhoods so that they can keep it working for the neighborhood in the way that it always has. So we just have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yeah, Tim?
Well, one comment is that the transcripts of those community meetings are in the library here. It's just thrilling reading, because folks were there until 1 a.m, both pro and against, complaining about how long their commutes took because the traffic on Hillsborough Street, and talking about the environmental issues, and talking about what they would lose if the neighborhood was destroyed. So it's definitely worth checking out. But I guess the question is for Mr. Patterson, and I don't really know quite how to phrase this, but thinking about the future of the neighborhood and this kind of leadership transition that you kind of alluded to, I'd love to hear maybe more of your thoughts on what's worked and what's been hard, and what it'll take for Crest Street to move forward with the same strength that it has had historically.
Well, I guess the best answer to that is this, is that nothing comes easy. And when the elderly people in the neighborhood began to die out, and we had that 4-year thing that the original residents of Crest Street had to remain there before they could dispose of the property. And people from across town began to transition into the neighborhood. And the truth of the matter is this, is that you can take an application, you can look at it, and you can read it, and anybody can get by that application. But you really don't know the person until you live with him, until he's in the neighborhood. Now, I say this, and I say it to everybody. You need to know who your neighbor is. You need to know more than just say that you see him out there cutting his grass. You need to know something about his character and his behavior practice and all of these kind of things. We knew that, what our neighbor was like prior to redevelopment of Crest Street. And maybe 5-10 years after then. But when the older folk began to die out, and the transition of people from downtown and other areas like that, they didn't bring with them the same values that we had in the neighborhood. So I'm saying to you is that I don't care where you are, where you're going, know who your neighbor is. It's a sad thing that something can happen to your neighbor and you're living right next door to him and you don't even know it.
So a couple of things. I mean, your question's a good one because there are not a lot of tap Pattersons.
For sure.
Have you been grooming somebody to take over for you?
Oh, yes. When I find somebody I think that is dedicated, thinking about the growth of the community and not become just in stagnation or something like that. You got a whole lot of ideas and young folk have now that they just don't agree with my thinking, and I guess that's because of my age and my upbringing and all of that. Has a whole lot. I don't cater to a whole lot of foolishness.
The church is still a real anchor in the community, and is still a real source of strength and continuity.
The church is 136 years old. So we were told this second oldest Baptist church in the neighborhood. And another thing is that years and years ago, when we was on redevelopment, they found over 1,100 graves in the old Crest Street graveyard, which told me, I used to go over there often and just looking at the graves, the birth dates and the deceased dates of it, which told me, and I don't have no proof, and I can't make you believe it, it had to be the central burn ground for black folk in the city of Durham. And I'll tell you why, because the neighborhood cemetery, the neighborhood cemetery precedes the city cemetery. There was Maplewood over there for whites and Beechwood for blacks. Both of these cemeteries came on after redevelopment, you know what I'm saying, of the Crest St community. But over in Longtown, there was a little small cemetery on, what was that, Sedgefield and East End Avenue. There was a little small cemetery to the side of that church. And when we went on Colcott Street, there was a little small cemetery. So it suggests to me that that area was probably a slave plantation over there, and that when the man Hicks owned that property over there, and maybe that property was designated as a burn ground for black folk. I don't know, but I'm going to try to find out before I close my eyes. I'll put it that way.
We have time maybe for one more question. Anybody?
So is the cemetery still there?
No, all the graves got moved, right?
Yes.
Yeah, they all got moved as part of the renovation, which I'm sure was not an easy decision in the neighborhood. That's kind of, hallowed ground, but I think that was part of, they're still near the church, is that right?
Well.
Where's the cemetery now?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Closer to 15501,
No.
or over Marine Road.
Well, I tell you.
Near Old Adams.
I tell you, how many people are familiar with west side of Durham? You know what Adams Concrete is?
Yeah.
Okay, there's this little service road, Durham service road that runs, that's West Pedigree Street.
Off Kangaroo.
And there's a white cemetery right behind the new warehouses. And then the Russell Cemetery is right behind that one. Okay, we maintain the house, but I don't know, the white cemetery is not being maintained at all. It's been years that I know of since there's been any burials made in that cemetery. It's grown up.
We want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and let's thank our panelists. We are planning another panel in the spring that'll really be about looking forward. So some folks maybe that have been involved but sort of thinking forward as we see what happens with this election and we see what happens with some of the efforts that are happening right now about affordable housing. I think you all have given us a lot to think about in terms of what you learned and what we can learn from you. We're also going to be doing some kind of walking tour of downtown around some of this a little later. I know there's some other folks doing some of that. I think ours will probably have a few more historical stops, but we just appreciate your time so much on this cold and rainy evening. I hope you have a safe ride home, and thanks so much for being here.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.